Okay, folks. All right, what I wanted to do today is I wanted to talk and kind of develop some of what we discussed this morning in the first session. And this specifically has to do with the Emmanuel. In the Hebrew, we would pronounce that the Immanu, with us, one L, that there is a God with us. And this idea of the Emmanuel, God with us, has a lot of depth and complexity to it. So I want to walk through those scriptures and talk about that with you and discuss that with you, and we can do that. So this is a discussion and teaching format. So I will teach until you interrupt me with a question, and then we'll discuss. So if you want me to teach, then that'll be fine. But if you want to discuss, then the ball's in your court to interrupt me and ask your question. I do enjoy the Q&As. It's one of my most favorite things to do. Anybody have any questions or comments on this morning's session? Any thoughts or comments or questions? I'm not sure if that's a good sign or not. It's a good sign. If you have a Bible, you can turn to Isaiah 7. Isaiah 7. We will have some of the scriptures on the screens, so you can look there, and that may be helpful. Tyler, do you know how to check DSK on the camera? Yeah. You might want to check and see if DSK is on. That way the people out there can follow along the verses with us. You just turn it on and leave it on. That's fine. We're running a modified ship here. Okay, Isaiah chapter 7. During the days of Achaz, the son of Yotam, the son of Uzziah, I'm reading from Complete Jewish Bible, king of Yehuda, Rezin, the king of Aram, and Petkach, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, advanced on Jerusalem to attack it, but were unable to conquer it. It was told to the house of David that Aram and Ephraim had become allies. Achaz's heart began to tremble, as did the hearts of his people, like forest trees shaken by the wind. So what's happening is they're being surrounded in Jerusalem, and the king, Achaz, is naturally upset by this and afraid, and as are the people. Adonai says to Yeshayahu, that is Isaiah, "Go out now to meet with Achaz, you and your son Sha'ar Yashuv, at the end of the aqueduct from the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field, and say to him, take care to stay calm and unafraid. Don't be demoralized by these two smoldering stumps of firewood, by the blazing anger of Rezin and Aram, or the son of Remaliah, or because Aram, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have been plotting against you, thinking we will invade Yehuda, tear it apart, divide it amongst ourselves, and appoint the son of Tavel as king there." This is what. So here's a scenario that's happened. Isaiah is telling Achaz not to be afraid. Tells him to go out to this pool, the end of the aqueduct from the upper pool, on the road to the launderer's field. And then when he gets there, not to be afraid or demoralized by these two smoldering stumps of firewood. I'm not sure if the smoldering stumps are literal or if they are figurative, meaning Ephraim and Aram. Verse 7, this is what Adonai Elohim says. It won't occur, it won't happen. For the head of Aram is Damasek, and the head of Damasek is Rezin. In 65 years Ephraim will be broken, it will cease to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Shomron, the head of Shomron is the son of Remaliah. Without firm faith, you will not be firmly established. All right, so what Adonai is saying here is you don't need to worry about this, that Aram and Ephraim are going to fall and stumble, and they're not going to be established. They're not going to be successful in attacking and conquering Jerusalem. And then it says this, that your faith, without firm faith, you will not be firmly established. It's telling him to believe in this. Adonai spoke to Achaz in verse 10 and said, verse 11, ask Adonai your God to give you a sign. Ask it anywhere from the depths of Sheol to the heights above. So what Adonai is saying to Achaz is, you request a sign that I'm going to deliver you, that I'm going to set you free, and deliver you from these enemies who are set to conquer you. And Achaz answers, I won't ask, I won't test Adonai. And we might think at first that that's a good response, that is to not test Adonai. We're taught not to test Adonai, and we see that repeated from time to time. But in this case, there's something different that's happening. All right, the prophet says, listen here, is trying people's patience such a small thing for you that you must try the patience of my God as well? Therefore, Adonai himself will give you people a sign. So Adonai is leapfrogging Achaz and saying, okay, then, I won't give the sign to you, I'll give it to all the people, because this is a sign for all the people. Therefore, Adonai himself will give you people a sign. The young woman will become pregnant. There's some discussion about the young woman. Some people say it's a maiden who's a virgin. Some just say it's a young bride. The young woman will become pregnant, bear a son, and name him Immanuel, God is with us. By the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good, he will eat curdled milk and wild honey. Yes, before the child knows enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose 2 kings you dread will be left abandoned. Adonai will bring the king of Ashur on you, your people, your father's house. These will be days worse than any you've known since Ephraim broke loose from Yehudah. All right, so what we see here is that Achaz, who is not a good king, and he is trying the patience of Adonai. Adonai says, I'm going to, for my own sake, defend you and your kingdom and Jerusalem, and we're going to protect you from Ephraim. Ephraim, of course, is the northern kingdom. Judah and Jerusalem is the southern kingdom. And I'm going to protect you from this, and in so doing, I'm going to provide you with a sign that I'm going to do it. And this would be the time when you would ask God for a sign. And he refuses to do that, and this is where we get the name Immanuel. All right. Moving on. We know from the books of the Kings and the Chronicles that Achaz was a very evil king. He's not a good man. Adonai had in mind to preserve Judah and to bring them through the fire. Achaz has another son, whose name Hezekiah, who inherits the throne after his father. Hezekiah is probably second to David in reputation as a good king of Judah, a good king of the people of Jacob. In all that he did, he restored the temple, he restored worship of Adonai, he tore down his father's altars, pagan idolatry, etc. Adonai is making Achaz a promise that he's going to be with him and deliver him, and the sign of it will be his son, who will be named Immanuel. Well, if that's the case, if we go from Achaz's son in the prophecy, the young woman will give birth to a son, and you'll name him Immanuel. How do we get from Immanuel to Hezekiah? We have a gap there, a missing step. What happened to the Immanuel? Well, a couple thoughts on this. Achaz was a worshiper of Molech, and Molech had as its characteristic idolatry that also included child sacrifice. And so what we have is Achaz worshiping Molech. A reasonable conclusion might be that Achaz put his son Immanuel through the fire, because we never hear from Immanuel again. We never hear from the child. And so the child, this idea of the child, disappears. Indeed, shortly after this encounter with Isaiah, Achaz turns instead to Aram and Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, abandoning both the promise and the sign. All right, so Hezekiah comes on the stage, and we pick up Hezekiah's life in 2 Kings chapter 18. So if you want to switch over to 2 Kings chapter 18, we can continue there. Malachim Bet in some of your Bibles, 2 Kings chapter 18. Let's start from 18, verse 1. In the 3rd year of Hoshea, the king of Elah, the king of Israel, that Hizkiyahu, the son of Achaz, king of Yehudah, began his reign. One of the things you have to be careful with when you're reading through Chronicles and Kings in the Bible and some of the prophet books, like this part in Isaiah where we were, it'll refer to the king of Israel, king of Judah, king of Yehuda, king of Judah, back and forth. And you have to be mindful that there were two kingdoms here. There was northern kingdom and southern kingdom. And it'll say, in such and such year of the king, and you have to be careful to check and talk about what king we're talking about. All right, so this is the third year of Hoshea, king of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the king of Achaz, the son of Achaz, king of Yehuda, began his reign. He was 25 years old when he began his reign. He ruled for 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Avi, the daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right from Adonai's perspective, following the example of everything David, his ancestor, had done. Removed the high places, smashed the standing stones, cut down the Asherah, broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, because in those days the people of Israel were making offerings to it, calling it Nehushtan, or serpent, or bronze. He puts his trust in Adonai, the God of Israel. After him there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, nor had there been among those before him. He clung to Adonai and did not leave off following him, obeyed his mitzvot which Adonai had given him. Adonai was with him. We're in verse 7 now of 2 Kings chapter 18. Wherever he went out to battle, he did well. He rebelled against the king of Ashur and refused to be his vassal, drove the Philistine back to Azah, laid waste their territory. So we see here, this is both a man who's after God and the blessings thereof in Hezekiah. All right. Let's skip on down to, I think we could probably go to 13. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sancherib, some of your Bibles might say Sennacherib, king of Ashur, advanced against all the fortified cities of Yehuda and captured them. Hezekiah, king of Yehuda, sent this message to the king of Ashur at Lachish: I've done wrong. If you'll go away from me, I will pay whatever penalty you impose on me. So what happens is Hezekiah tries to bribe his way out of being conquered and sends an offer of money to this. And so the king Ashur imposed upon Hezekiah a penalty of 10 tons of silver, a ton of gold. Hezekiah gave him all the silver that could be found in the house of Adonai and in the treasuries. And at that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the sanctuary and from the doorposts and gave it all to the king of Ashur. All right, continuing on, verse 17. From Lachish, the king of Ashur sent Tartan, Rav Saras, and Rav Shachah to King Hezekiah in Jerusalem with a large army. They advanced and came to Jerusalem. Upon arrival, they came and positioned themselves by the aqueduct from the upper pool, which is by the road to the launderer's field. Anybody notice anything? We've been here before, right? Achaz was in the same place. Remember, Isaiah told Achaz to go out to this place at the end of the aqueduct by the launderer's field. And now we've got Rav Shachah in this army that is coming and advancing, and they're coming to the same place. They summoned the king, but those answering the call were Eliakim and let's see, and Shavna and Yoach. Verse 19, Rav Shachah addressed them. Tell Hezekiah, here is what the great king, the king of Ashur, says. What makes you so confident? Do you think that mere spoken words constitute strategy and strength for battle? In whom then are you trusting when you rebel against me like this? Now look, relying on Egypt is like using a broken stick or a staff. When you lean on it, it punctures your hand. That's what Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is like for anyone who puts his trust in him. But if you tell me, we trust in Adonai our God, then isn't he the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed? Telling Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship before this altar in Jerusalem. All right then, make a wager with my lord, the king of Ashur. I will give you 2,000 horses if you can find enough riders for them. How then can you repulse even one of my master's lowest ranked army officers? Yet you are relying on Egypt for chariots and riders. Do you think I have come up to this place to destroy it without Adonai's approval? Adonai said to me, attack this land and destroy it. All right, so what is Rav Shaka saying here? And try to get a sense of who this Rav Shaka is. He's a deputy general of the king, and he speaks with a great deal of arrogance and bravado. He says, first of all, what makes you so confident? If you think you've got strategy and courage for the battle, I'll give you horses. Can you even find riders for them? It's like, I'll give you a help, and then we can go to war. And then it says, if you tell me, verse 22, we trust in Adonai our God, then isn't he the one on whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed? So basically he's saying that since Hezekiah has removed the high places and required that they worship in Jerusalem, then how could that possibly have pleased Adonai? What Rav Shaka is overlooking, or is deliberately not referencing, is that Hezekiah did the right thing by removing those high places and those altars, and that the worship of Adonai did need to be performed ceremonially, at least, with the sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. And so Rav Shaka is basically misrepresenting the worship of Adonai. And then he says this, verse 25, do you think I have come up to this place to destroy it without Adonai's approval? Adonai said to me, attack this land and destroy it. The Eliakim, Shebna, and Yoach respond to Rav Shaka, and they said, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, since we understand it. Don't speak to us in Hebrew while the people on the wall are listening. And it's a way of kind of mocking him. Let's see. Later, verse 29, Rav Shaka says, this is what the king says, don't let Hezekiah deceive you. He won't be able to save you. Don't let, verse 30, don't let Hezekiah make you trust in Adonai, saying Adonai will save us. Don't listen to Hezekiah. This is what the king says, make peace and surrender to me, etc. Don't listen, verse, let's see, verse, where am I at here? For 32, don't listen to Hezekiah. He's only deluding you when he says Adonai will save us. And then verse 33, has any God of any nation ever saved his land from the power of the king of Ashur? And he goes through and lists off some of these nations and some of these pagan peoples that didn't defend their people. Where is the God of any country that has saved its country from my power, so that Adonai might be able to save Jerusalem from my power? People kept still and didn't answer him. They refused to answer him. So they went and they reported to Hezekiah what was said. In verse 19, we have this. On hearing it, King Hezekiah tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, entered the house of Adonai, and he said to him, this is what we say. Go down to verse 3. Today is a day of trouble, rebuke, and disgrace. Children are ready to be born, but there's no strength to bring them to birth. Maybe Adonai your God will hear all the words of Rav Shaka, whom his master the king of Ashur has sent, and will rebuke the message which Adonai your God has heard. So pray for the remnant that is left. So they went out to Isaiah and asked Isaiah to intercede. Isaiah says, don't be afraid of the words that you heard the servants of the king say. And so Hezekiah prophesies that Rav Shaka is going to return to his land. So verse 7, I will put a spirit in him that will make him hear a rumor and return to his own land, and there I will cause him to die by the sword in his own land. And indeed, verse 8, Rav Shaka returned, having heard that the king of Ashur had left Lachish, and so forth, that Rav Shaka returned. Let's see where it says that. We see this play out. First of all, before that, Rav Shaka sends a response to Hezekiah, taunting him. And then Hezekiah went into the temple in the presence of Adonai and prayed. and asked Adonai to save them. Verse 20 of chapter 19, Isaiah the son of Amoz says this message to Hezekiah. Adonai, the God of Israel, says, you prayed to me against Sennacherib, king of Ashur. I've heard you. And then the prophecy. And then if you go down to verse 33, 34, Adonai says, I will defend this city and save it, both for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. That night the angel of Adonai went out and struck down 185,000 men in the camp of Ashur. Early the next morning they were all there, all of them corpses dead. So Sennacherib, king of Ashur, left and went and returned to live back in Nineveh. One day as he was worshiping in the temple of Nisroch, his god, his sons struck him with a sword, and so forth. Okay, so passes Sennacherib and Rabshakeh in history. Why do we spend a little bit of time on this? Because of the mocking that was done, the taunting of the God of Israel that was done by Rabshakeh and Sennacherib. And we see this deliverance, this amazing deliverance at the hand of Adonai, deliberately and directly against a huge force, over 200,000 men. 185,000 troops of them are killed in one night, and the siege of Jerusalem is broken. This ought to set the stage for Hezekiah's courage and strength before Adonai. But what do we see happening very quickly? In 2 Kings chapter 20, we see this, verses 8. If you skip down to verse 8, verse 1, chapter 20, verse 1, around this time Hezekiah became ill to the point of death. Isaiah came and said to him, here's what Adonai says, put your house in order because you are going to die, you will not live. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed. And then Hezekiah says to Isaiah in verse 8, what sign will there be that Adonai will heal me and that I will be able to go up to the house of Adonai on the third day? Isaiah says to him, here is the sign for you from Adonai that Adonai will do what he said. Do you want the shadow of the sundial to go forward 10 intervals or backward 10 intervals? So what's happening is first Adonai says that Hezekiah is going to die. Hezekiah panics and prays, and then Adonai changes his mind about this, and Isaiah comes to give him a prophecy that he's not going to die. And so Hezekiah says, what's going to be the sign? And we've been here before with signs with Hezekiah's father, Ahaz. Ahaz refused a sign, and here Hezekiah is actually asking for a sign. And this is what the sign is, that Hezekiah has to choose. Will the sun go forward or will the sun go backwards in the sky? Hezekiah answered, verse 10, it's easy for the shadow to go down. No, let the sundial return backwards. So the sun has to go backwards across the sky. Okay? Isaiah called out to Adonai. He brought the shadow of the sundial of Ahaz backwards after it had gone down that far. All right. So looking ahead now, verse 12, what we see is the king of Bavel heard that Hezekiah had been ill. He sends a letter and a gift to him. And verse 13, Hezekiah listens to the messengers and shows them the building where he kept his treasures. It says in verse 13, there was nothing in his palace or his entire domain that Hezekiah did not show them. Isaiah comes to him in verse 14 and says, what did you do? And Hezekiah answers, they came from Bavel, and what have they seen? They've seen everything in my palace. There isn't a thing among my treasures that I haven't shown them. Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear what the Adonai says, the day will come when everything is in your palace, along with everything your ancestors stored up until today, will be carried off to Bavel. Nothing will be left, says Adonai. They will carry off some of your descendants, your own offspring. They will be made eunuchs serving in the palace of the king of Bavel. So because Hezekiah responded to these emissaries from this king, because of this, because he went and showed him all of his wealth and power, because of this, Adonai says, okay, you're going to be carried off in your generation. Your own offspring will be made eunuchs, and you're going to go to Bavel, or Babylon. And look at Hezekiah's response, verse 19. Hezekiah says to Isaiah, the word of Adonai, which you have just told me, is good. Isn't it enough, though, if peace and truth continue, at least through my lifetime? All right, so here's the dilemma that we have. What happened where Hezekiah stumbled here towards the end of his life? We've covered a lot of ground in Scripture, and I'm sorry if I've put some of you to sleep. That's an occupational hazard for a teacher. That's okay. I could juggle or do backflips and maybe wake some of you up, perhaps. It's okay if you're sleeping. I'm not the least bit offended. So what's happening here that Hezekiah stumbles at the end of his life, at the end of his tenure? There is no king other than perhaps David, perhaps not even Solomon, who was so respected and revered, who led such a remnant. And what happened at the end of his tenure that he stumbled in this way? And what I would submit to you is that what we see is a connection to some of the same weaknesses in his father. Or if not a connection, at least a thread or a storyline that's happening here. And here's the theory. It goes back to the Immanuel. What happened to the Immanuel, the child? See, we tend to think in terms of symbolic or metaphoric. It's easy for us to do that. But when Adonai is speaking to Achaz and Hezekiah, when he's speaking to them, it's real. When he says a maiden will give birth, he doesn't just take a step back and say, okay, so it's a metaphorical maiden, and the birth is going to be like giving birth to a ministry. And no, he would think there's going to be a child. So what happened to the Immanuel child, the actual child of Achaz, over whom the government was supposed to rest, right? Because we have this, if we want to go back to Isaiah 7 and look at some of these statements about the Immanuel, right? Let's see. Verse 14 of chapter 7, Adonai himself will give you people a sign. A young woman will become pregnant, bear a son, and name him Emmanuel, God with us. He will refuse evil and choose good, and so forth. So what happened to that leader, that ruler, that son of Achaz, who was going to be a man of God? And here's what I would submit to you, that we seem to think that perhaps the Immanuel was put to death in the fire. That's plausible to us. And then you've got Hezekiah. And Hezekiah is growing up. And consider the psychology of the legend of Hezekiah's older brother who was put to death, the Immanuel. Right? He was supposed to be the one. He was supposed to be the one to bring revival. And so Hezekiah is operating, perhaps, this is psychological conjecture, but let's just play it out a little bit. What if Hezekiah is operating under a double specter, the specter of his father Achaz and the specter of the Immanuel? He's got these two almost competing sets of expectations. It's the inheritance of Achaz, and it's the inheritance of the brother who was supposed to be this sort of Messianic figure. And that's what he would have been. He would have been a Messiah type, in the same way that Hezekiah is considered a Messiah type. All right. So we read about this, and that perhaps informs us of how Hezekiah at the end of his life stumbles and doesn't close the deal on what was given to him, but rather finds that he sort of compromises. And what happens is these emissaries come from this foreign king, and they're asking him questions, and Hezekiah wants to talk about how God has blessed him and shows him all the riches and treasures of his palace in all the strength. It's a way of showing strength. It's a way of revealing your strength. Now, it says in the text here, let me see if I can find it in my text. Brodak Baladan, so I'm chapter 20, verse 12. The king of Bavel heard that Hezekiah had been ill, so he sent a letter and a gift to him. What does it mean that the king of Bavel heard that Hezekiah had been sick? The king of Babylon. Did it mean that he heard that he was ill and he was going to die? Why would that be especially intriguing, except that maybe the king of Babylon might decide to conquer Judah? Why would that be intriguing? Let me suggest to you that the reason he sent a letter, the reason he was intrigued is because everybody was intrigued, because when the sun went backwards 6 hours in the sky, everybody noticed it, because it was a worldwide phenomenon. Everybody noticed. And the story would have come out. Oh, this is a story. This is Hezekiah prayed this prayer. He was sick. He was going to die, but God promised him he was going to recover. And so before he recovers, he's given a sign. And what is that sign? But the sun travels backwards in the sky. Do you see what's happening here? That the real intrigue was a miracle. What happened here? And the king of Babylon is inquiring about him being sick in order to perhaps get some more of the story. Why is this relevant to us? On this day especially. Because the sign of something in the sky, the phenomenon of a star in the sky, going backwards in one case, should remind us of another sky phenomenon that intrigued the people from Babylon. And that was the Magi who came to see Yeshua at his birth. Do you see, we've got this fascination with what's happening in the skies over Judah. And they send emissaries to inquire. And the star over the skies spoke of what? In the second case, spoke of the Immanuel, Yeshua, God with us. Right? Do you see all this stuff sort of overlapping and connecting and swirling? When they came, they spoke to Herod. Herod would have been very keen to find the child, because Herod is not an authentic king of the Jews, because Herod is not Jewish. So a king of the Jews, what's that? Yeah, or yes. Yeah, he's from the, yeah, I can't remember the name, but you're right. I haven't paused for questions. Anybody have any questions or input or thoughts or comments? I've just been going for a while. Do you see what's happening here? So Herod would have been eager to preserve his kingship and would have felt an immediate threat. An authentic king of the Jews would have been open to the birth, the Immanuel birth, in the same way that Achaz, the father of the Immanuel, scorned the Immanuel birth. Do you see that? All right. So they listened to the king, and then they went away, and the star which they saw in the east went in front of them until it came and stopped over the place where the child was. For me, I know people speculate about, what sort of astronomical phenomenon could have occurred, like comets and these kind of things. No, I think it was just a near-field effect. It was a star that was relatively low to the ground, such that you could follow the star around and go, okay, it's right here. You would had to have followed it that way. You don't get that by following a star that's way out in the heavens. It's like the moon. You look up and no matter where you move, it's in the same place. Okay. So they listened to the king. They went away. The star it stopped where the child was. They entered the house. They saw the child with his mother Miriam. They prostrated themselves and worshipped him. Do you see the contrast to what happened the first time? The Emmanuel was meant to be a Messiah to the people of Israel under Ahaz. Ahaz scorned the Emmanuel. Upon entering the house, they worshipped, they offered gifts. When you think of the star, we think of the natural phenomenon in the heavens, supernovas, comets, stars, etc., all of which could have moved if they were pretty close to the earth in an erratic way. But this reminds us, or should remind us, of another experience, the pillar of fire by night that went in front of the Israelites in the desert. The star that the Magi followed is at least acting as the same kind of pillar of fire in the desert as they came across the desert. They may have had a similar appearance, being a kind of his radiance. We have this same radiance in the form of the Shekhinah, the radiant form of the presence of Adonai. So the Magi worshipped this king of the Jews, unlike Hezekiah, who, when he was visited by men from Babylon, inquiring about the sign, it says he worshipped upon them. And that's what it says in the Hebrew, that he poured worship upon them. Here, worship is put upon Yeshua, the King of the Jews and the King of the nations. The Magi worship this King of the Jews, unlike Hezekiah. The Magi then go their own secret way back to Egypt. Joseph, the husband of Miriam, is warned in a dream to flee to Egypt. Herod is furious that he's been tricked, and he orders the massacre of all boys under the age of 2 in the region of Bethlehem in order to try to kill the infant king, in order to try to kill the Emmanuel, the child who is God with us. So this is the question, one of the questions. What would have happened if Ahaz had not done something to the Emmanuel? We know that Adonai keeps his promises, so there was a child born, there was an Emmanuel somewhere. And it makes sense that Ahaz would have either subjugated him or killed him or done something. What if that hadn't happened? Well, the Emmanuel, at least in the understanding, would have been like unto Hezekiah. See, here's a thought. We think in terms of the measure of Adonai's powerful influence on the earth, on the affairs of the earth. We think of that in terms of ourselves. In other words, if I'm going to have an impact on my family, if I'm going to have an impact on this congregation, then I must keep up my spiritual disciplines. I must maintain my spiritual efforts. I have to study, I have to pray, I have to worship, I have to do these things. And that'll somehow lubricate the skids of my spiritual life so that I can be a good leader to you. We think in terms of that. And make no mistake, I need to do all those things. That's my responsibility. And the level that I do not do them does handicap my effectiveness as a leader and as a servant of you, of all of you. But let me suggest to you that there's another dynamic here, and that is Adonai's influence from a position of sovereignty and grace. In other words, when I read of revivals in history, or when I read of the types of Hezekiah and some of these others, then I am convinced of this, that it is to some degree or another a measure of Adonai's sovereignty, that he overwhelms these characters in history with grace in order to do what needs to be done at that moment. When I look at the stories of the Moravians or Count Zinzendorf or some of these others, 300 years ago, we've got a Messianic congregation started by Count Zinzendorf as part of the Moravian outreach to some of the Jews at that time. When I think about some of these things, I see the grace of God and I see the responsiveness in the person. And somehow those two things work together. Somehow it is the grace of Adonai and it is my responsiveness to him, being willing to do whatever it takes to go to the end of whatever this journey is. This is the failure of Hezekiah, that he gave up in the last in the last chapter. Literally the last line of his narrative there in Malachbet, 2 Kings. Literally the last line of his narrative ends with his sons being eunuchs in Babylon, and him saying it's good enough. At least there'll be peace. I don't know how to motivate you any way other than just to say it, perhaps, that we maintain our disciplines, we maintain our worship and our prayer, we maintain our study and our knowledge and our fellowship with like-minded believers. And then we plead for the power and the overwhelming grace of Adonai to do more in us and through us. One of the prayers my wife and I, we ride together almost always to synagogue, and we always pray on the way. And one of the things that we always pray is that Adonai would overwhelm our efforts, that he would do more with us than just the sum of what we do. And we play chords, and I talk for 35 minutes, and we do some of these things. We sing. That there would be a powerful spiritual work being done in and through all that. And none of it happens unless I'm willing to do the work. And none of it happens unless the power of Adonai shows up. And yet, there is this threat to all of us that at the end of it, we may stumble. We may stumble in the last chapter. One of the lessons that I could take away from this, I could probably preach an entire message on this, and that is, the twilight is coming, the days are coming, don't stumble. The days are coming, the twilight is coming. I shared the verse with you from Jeremiah. I love this verse. Jeremiah is complaining to Adonai. I should pull it out for you. He's complaining to Adonai, and he says, I've labored and so on and so forth. And Adonai says, if you have stumbled with men, walking with men, how will you run with horses? And that's all he says. It's not quite the sympathetic, nurturing, kind response you would hope for. Yeah, I could speak for a while on don't stumble. The days are short. Finish well. Don't be a Hezekiah. I'm sorry, that's a terrible thing to say. But don't stumble in the final lap. And that is one of the messages here that can be taken away. But the other one, too, is that the sovereignty of Adonai in the appearance, the ultimate appearance of the Immanuel, was entirely within his timing. And this is the message of Matthew when over and over again Matthew says this. He says, this happened in order to fulfill, this happened to fulfill, this happened to fulfill. Even one of those fulfillments is the Immanuel passage. All right, so what's happening is that the time that Yeshua came was the right time. Apparently, the Immanuel did not turn out to be the right time. But let me submit to you that the reason it was the wrong time is because people weren't ready for it. The people weren't prepared for it. And that's the very difficult thing. Yeshua is returning to a bride, and at some point he will ultimately return to whatever bride he's got. But at the same time, there seems to be indication that the bride has to make herself ready. And this is a truth. All right, questions or comments? Yes?
You said that Hezekiah worshipped, the commanders.
Right.
Could that be a type of Judah, and that he's not worshiping, the Savior that he has, but the true God? He's worshiping, a false religion.
Okay.
And rejecting God as Judah rejected Yeshua. And then his sons went up as eunuchs, impotent. In a spiritual sense, Israel wants to impotent also.
Okay, so that's very good, Michael. So what Mike is saying is that when you say that Zechariah placed worship upon these emissaries from Babylon, is that a type of Judah, the people of Judah, worshiping something other than Adonai, and their responsiveness is, and the judgment is there. And yes, you're absolutely right. There's no question that the people of Israel, people of Jacob, did not put their full heart into Adonai and worship of him. There is this interesting dynamic that happens between the people and the king. And the people are reflective of the king, and the king is reflective of the people. It's almost a romance. They lead each other, and they are led by each other. So the king is not going to be able to overcome all of the objections and reluctance of the people, and likewise the people may not be able to overcome a corrupt king. So they do work together. But yes, I would agree with that.
I mean, the other thing you also have is you're saying that the actual Emmanuel, was there but wasn't there.
Right.
Put to death, whatever. I mean, the same thing happened with Messiah, who was Emmanuel.
Right.
He was put to death by
Yeah, yeah. And that, now we're getting into the Messianic aspect of it. The Emmanuel, God with us, who was put to death. The Emmanuel, God with us, who was the sacrifice for our sins. The Emmanuel under Ahaz was put to death for a pagan sacrifice, and obviously a corruption of what was supposed to happen. And bear in mind that in a true malevolent sense, if I can say that word, what the enemy is doing, the enemy's plans, the enemy always wants to corrupt God's plan and God's authentic things. That's why we have corrupted relationships, we have corrupted intimacies, we have corrupted all things, all the institutions, all the sacred and beautiful things that God has created, the enemy has corrupted and created false imitations of, evil and demonic and distorted imitations of. The distortion of Yeshua and his sacrifice would be the Emmanuel and his sacrifice, and also the sacrifice of the little boys. The little boys were put to death, and there was no atonement. The little boys were put to death as martyrs, and for no other good reason other than Yeshua. And then that's a profound point for me as well, this idea that the first martyrs in history to Yeshua would have been these anonymous little boys from this tiny village 5 miles outside of Jerusalem. And now we understand Rachel weeping for her children. And the concept of Rachel weeping for her children is a deep concept in Judaism. If you talk to a rabbi about what it means that Rachel weeping for her children, you can go a lot of ways with that, and there's a lot to that. And then if you wrap that back to Yeshua and talk about that, because that's a historical, I believe that's been proven. I've read articles that that's been a proven fact, that there was a massacre of little boys around that time by the king. So.
But then you come across, once again on the internet, things that say that never happened.
Oh.
If it did, it was just localized. It wasn't throughout the whole nation.
Right. Well, I believe it was localized, but no less a horror and no less an atrocity. And yeah, and absolutely. But again, we have this dragnet sort of assault, which is repeated over and over again. We had it with the Abimelech and the anti-Semitic beginnings coming out of Egypt. This is the story. We have it with at Purim. We have it with over the Haman type, the Hitler type. I mean, these things are repeated over and over again throughout history. It's the idea of putting to death Israel, because Israel represents Adonai's insertion point into humanity. I mean, do you realize that Israel and the people of Israel is how God inserts himself into this human sphere? Did you have? Yeah. Jerry, go ahead.
Isn't it strange that Hezekiah was given an extra 15 years, and during that 15 years he sired a son that was the worst king of Israel?
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable, and you might be touching on the question: should Hezekiah just have died and gone to sleep with his fathers? And it's an ethical question. Jerry's talking about the fact that Hezekiah sired another son after his illness. Linda?
Well,
Mm-hmm.
All right, so on this, he had to be the Emmanuel
Mm-hmm.
for us.
Yeah.
And the other is that on a mountain that's just right outside of Jerusalem, there is a kibbutz, that is kibbutz Rahel.
Oh.
And they have a statue there. And she is like weeping, and there's children
Oh.
around her. So they do take it,
Yeah. Yeah. Just to repeat your point so that they can get it on the broadcast, Linda. Linda was saying that we have Adam from the creation, and Yeshua is the second Adam. And we have Yeshua, the Emmanuel, and he is a kind of second Emmanuel, the first Emmanuel being the son of Achaz. And it's a very good point. And then, of course, the kibbutz outside of Jerusalem with the statue of Rachel weeping for her children, with children around her. Other comments or questions or thoughts? Anyone? Anyone? Nothing at all. Well, I've kept you for quite some time. Thank you for your patience, and hopefully this was interesting. If you're listening to this online, you're welcome to send me comments or questions by email. Would love to speak with you. Thank you. Shabbat shalom. Yes, got a question. All right. I threatened to shut things down, and then they...
Yes, that's okay. So in Yeshua, in Isaiah,
Mhm.
that we went over about a young woman will become pregnant and bear a son.
Right.
And then when we go to chapter 9, when it says, "For a child is born to us, a son is given to us."
Yep.
Is that talking of the Emmanuel in 7, or is this the Yeshua that will come as
So, yeah.
Emmanuel?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Linda's question is, we have this idea of a child being born repeated in Isaiah chapter 9. And so the question is that, again, a refrain of the Emmanuel? And for me, it's easy for me to say yes, because it just seems so obvious and so clear. And it wouldn't, in the context, be obvious to be speaking to anything else. You could certainly... discuss it from a different perspective. Just looking to see if there's anything that I missed from the context.
9 talks about him being, Sar Shalom,
Right,
El Gibor.
right,
So that's Messiah.
right. Yeah, and for me, the Messianic aspect of the Immanuel in chapter 7 is equally valid for me. And also, it would be that way among the sages as well. They would definitely see that as an inference of a Messianic figure of some kind, especially within the context of the Achaz to Hezekiah transition there, where Hezekiah was definitely a Messiah. Remember that a Messiah in Judaism and tradition is just somebody who saves you, somebody who delivers you. Mordecai was a Messiah, and so forth and so on. So it wouldn't have been blasphemous for Hezekiah to be a Messiah type or a Messianic figure. But yeah, I'll look at this a little bit more and see if there is anything, because we have a reference also to the Emmanuel in chapter 8. Adonai says to me, take a large tablet, and let's see, then I had relations with my wife, verse 3, she became pregnant, gave birth to a son. Adonai said to me, name him Maher-shalal, Hashbaz, because before the child knows how to cry, the riches of Damascus and the spoils of Shomron will be carried off. And then it has this in verse 8, speaking of Adonai's response, it will sweep through Yehuda, flooding everything, and reach up even to the neck. It'll fill the whole expanse of the land. God is with us, again in the Hebrew, of the Immanuel, and so forth. And then you pass that along, and you end up in chapter 9, verse 1, which is an extension of the same dialogue. So the prophetic dialogue is consistent from chapter 8. So it is entirely possible that the chapter 8 Messianic may be disconnected from the chapter 7. But I'm not convinced of that. I'd have to do some more study to see. That's a good question. We can follow up on that. Any other thoughts or questions? Anyone? All righty. Thank you all for staying, and let me know if there's anything else you'd like to discuss. Thank you. Shabbat shalom. Oh, let me shut it off.